And so if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel supported in an environment, it's very difficult to talk about it. A couple of months ago in the Globe and Mail, there's a men's column now in the Globe and Mail, I don't know if anybody reads it, but instead of being what could be useful, talking about men's experience in the world, it's basically an anti-feminist diatribe. And in one of these columns, this guy, Michael Coren, says, commenting on the panel on violence, he says, the panel on violence report reported that something like 40% of the women interviewed in a survey said they had been sexually assaulted, or they had experienced attempted sexual assault. And he said, well, I don't know any women who have been sexually assaulted, so there must be some city somewhere in Canada where everybody who lives there has been victims of sexual assault, because nobody I know has been sexually assaulted. And, you know, I thought, like, who the hell is going to tell this guy if they've been sexually assaulted, given his attitudes? How the hell would he possibly know whether anybody he knew had been sexually assaulted? I've been sexually assaulted or attempted. I've experienced attempted sexual assault. I never talked about it my whole life until a couple of years ago, even though I've been an active feminist for 20 years. Because when I was young, it was just part of the territory. You just lived with it and put it away somewhere where it hurt. It hurt a lot. It came up at certain times, but you didn't talk about it. And you didn't really think it was part of your politics. It was just some personal experience that happened a long time ago. And so breaking down the solitude between men and women on this issue is very important. I'll come back to later why it is. Why it's important to break that silence. And I know the CAW has an ad talking about breaking the silence. For men to understand, especially union brothers, to understand the impact of sexual violence and other forms of violence against women. And for women in the labor movement to feel safe in mixed groups, safe enough to share those experiences. Violence against women is a union issue not only in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace, and not only because services to women members require that there be a consciousness of what could be happening in the family in terms of spousal assault. And it's not only important because as good citizens, we want to counter what is a terrible blight in our society. It's a fundamental question of solidarity. Because I believe that there's no issue that creates division between men and women more than violence against women. And there's no more fundamental threat to women's equality than violence against women. You've probably heard the statistics. 1 in 10 women, or 1 in 8, have experienced spousal assault. And we're talking repeated spousal assault. Usually a woman's been hit 30 times before she even calls the police. 1 in 4, that's the lowest figure we have. 40% is the highest figure. Women have experienced sexual assault. Half before the age of 17. 1/3 of college-age university women report being sexually assaulted or experiencing attempted sexual assault. 1/3 within 1 year. 60% of women who are murdered by an intimate partner. And if you compare that to men who are murdered, there's no comparison. The number of men murdered by intimate partners is something like 1 or 2%. 98% of perpetrators of sexual assault are men. And 80% of victims are women. Violence against women is not like other crime. And I think that's important because you're going to hear a lot in the election about law and order. And a lot of the parties are going to use violence against women and children as a way to promote a basically reactionary law and order agenda. And I'm going to come back to this and say, while it's important to have, for the courts to take seriously crimes against women and children, to have serious sentencing for men who murder their wives. Right now, for example, in Winnipeg, a study that was done shows that men who murder their wives get about half of the sentence of other murderers. In other words, the judge can understand the reason for the guy to murder his wife better than he can understand why someone would murder a stranger. You know, the thing of crimes of passion, so-called. So we need to change that to value the lives of women and children. But a law and order agenda will not solve the problem of violence against women and children. I don't think it'll solve the problem of violence in society at all, but it definitely won't solve that problem. The issue of violence against women crosses class lines. It exists in all classes of society, in all cultures. You know, we like to think sometimes, oh, it's other people coming here and bringing their violent cultures. That's bullshit. Our own culture is very violent, our own culture. Canadian culture, British culture, my culture, which is, I guess, Jewish culture. All cultures have profound levels of violence against women. I haven't seen one yet that doesn't. The cause of violence against women is not only related to levels of violence in the society. It is related, for sure. You know, a violent culture promotes more violence everywhere, including violence against women. But generally, there's other reasons for it. A lot of the men who commit acts of violence against women don't commit other acts of violence. For example, a man who batters his wife will often say, well, you know, she made me lose my temper. But when he's with his buddies and someone makes him lose his temper, he doesn't hit them. Or in the workplace, he doesn't commit other violent acts. Men who commit incest, for example, are often solid citizens. Oh, I can't believe that of this man. I mean, he's good in his community, he works hard, he's a good person. Appears on the outside to be a very good person and very responsible, not a criminal in any way whatsoever. Violence against women is about power relations. It's about inequality. It's about sexism. And it comes from the notions of what we in the feminist movement call a patriarchal society. Now that sounds like rhetoric. But what patriarchy means is the rule of the father. And in our culture, in Western culture, when the family was created, the nuclear family, it was very much that women and children were the property of men. And so in England, you had a rule that said you're not allowed to beat your wife with a belt or a rod any thicker than your thumb. Okay, so in English law, you were given permission to beat your wife as long as you didn't use anything well, that's pretty, I don't have that big thumbs, and that's pretty major. In fact, in Canadian law, we have this about children. You're not allowed to use excessive force against your children, but you're allowed to use force, but that's another issue. So that we had, in fact, it was legitimate to beat your wife. And in Canada, no more than 12 years ago, when Margaret Mitchell raised the issue of battered women in the House of Commons, the male MPs laughed. Violence against women is caused by inequality of women, and it reinforces inequality of women. And I want to talk about how that happens. Now you say, well, she's saying that, we'll prove it. Maybe you're not saying that, but I will prove it anyway. If we look at how violence occurs and when it occurs, we can see the relationship between violence against women and inequality. For example, when does violence against women increase? Surprisingly, it doesn't necessarily increase in tough economic times, as one would expect. You know, people are frustrated, they strike out. We don't have proof that it increases in tough economic times, but we do have proof for example, in situations of battering, that there are 2 times when a man who's going to commit this crime begins. One is when the woman becomes more vulnerable, when she becomes pregnant, for example. If you hear stories of battered women, you'll often hear that he started to hit me when I became pregnant, because she was more vulnerable. And the other is when she strikes out in independence, so that most of the murders of spouses and ex-spouses take place when the woman leaves a violent relationship. Those are the 2 instances where we see a definite increase in violence against women. And we also see that the most vulnerable women are the most subject to violence. So that Aboriginal women, 80% of Aboriginal women have experienced sexual assault, according to a recent study of the Ontario Organization of Aboriginal Women. 56% of women with disabilities have been sexually assaulted. A majority of women with disabilities have been sexually assaulted. Prostitutes are assaulted an average, and this is violent sexual assault, 5 times a year. Why? Because prostitutes are seen as most vulnerable, the cops aren't going to protect them, and are most objectified by men who deal with them, just as sexual objects. And so there's less barriers to those assaults. The more a woman can be objectified, whether because she's from another race or because she's a sex worker, the more likely she is to be sexually assaulted. And the attitudes in society, and they haven't changed that much, are to blame the woman for the assault. She was asking for it. She shouldn't have gone to his hotel room. She had her blouse unbuttoned and showed her cleavage. She shouldn't have made me so mad. And if we think those attitudes are changing, we should just look at, and I notice you have this article on your table about the kissing judge, Rebick, and I'm sure you've seen, there's been lots of media on this. I'm sure you've seen the media on this. Now here's a guy, he's a judge, he's an older man, and he's accused of kissing a Crown attorney in a hallway and sticking his tongue in her mouth, which, if that's true, is under the law sexual assault, not sexual harassment, because unwanted sexual touching is sexual assault. And he's accused in another case of making sexual remarks to a Crown attorney in the middle of a business relationship. He says to her, he says to the male defense attorney, "I love you," in a professional sense, and he says to the woman Crown, "I loved you," in a lustful sense. Then he has this sort of jerky light switch where the switch is between the man's legs, and he turns it on. He says to her, I'd love to see you flick my switch." Now this is what he's accused of. I won't get into whether it's proven or not proven or what. So what happens? Well, fortunately the Judicial Council sends it to a hearing. It's a serious situation. But the media response to this hearing is very interesting. Because what happens, with the exception of this column by Michelle Landsberg, in every other commentary I've seen, many by women, what they do is they say, oh yes, this is an inappropriate behavior by the judge. You know, he should learn not to let his friendly demeanor get out of hand. And then they proceed to go after the women for being wimps. They say, well, these are Crown attorneys. They deal with murderers and rapists and robbers every day. How come they couldn't stand up to this guy? Why didn't they just tell him to F off? And so what we see is these women come forward, and they're on trial. Instead of saying the judge should lose his job for committing, in fact, let alone the sexual harassment, I'll come back to that, committing a criminal offense if he did indeed commit it. They're saying, well, these women shouldn't be Crown attorneys. They haven't got what it takes. They're wimps. And if they can't stand up to some old guy who's hassling them, then how the hell can they do their jobs? Now, I have some problems with the way a couple of these women are talking about the incident. I can't personally relate to, for example, the one woman who says that, after he shoved his tongue in her mouth, she thought she was going to get a disease and not be able to have children. Like, to me, that's something out of the 1950s. Who could believe that anymore? But that's not the issue. The issue is, here is a woman who is trying to do a job, who is wanting to be a professional, as Michelle Landberg says, accepted among the guys. She meets a judge who has a tremendous amount of power over her. He decides whether she succeeds or fails in that courtroom. And in addition, in this particular case, someone who she had a lot of respect for, who she sort of saw as a grandfatherly figure, who had been very kind to her in the past. And he violates her. He reduces her at that moment into a sexual object. And the humiliation of that for her, given who she was, who he was, what he did, and what her attitudes were, is devastating. So to this day, when she testifies, her experience of that, and I watched it, is the experience of a woman who has been sexually assaulted. Shame, humiliation, incredible amounts of pain. Now, maybe not everybody can relate to how she felt in that situation, but the reality is he assaulted her or harassed her and made her feel unable to do what she was doing, which was be a Crown attorney. And what everybody's forgetting in this discussion is he wasn't a co-worker. He wasn't a co-worker. He was a very powerful person in relation to her. And so the attitudes we see around the Rebick case, and in this case it's mostly women doing this, and this is one of the things that I find most disturbing about the current backlash, is that all the media, now they can't have men saying these kinds of things anymore, so they put women columnists in who, sort of were feminists sometime back in 1965, like Kim Campbell, and they do the job for them. And so what we see is the women who came forward being put on trial for charging the judge with sexual harassment. In addition to which, this is a judge who is supposed to be the role model for behavior for the entire society. Nobody talks about that either. And so the attitudes of blaming women, of putting women on trial when they complain, of thinking, it's the woman's fault, are still there. 2 years ago, I spoke at a CAW women's conference. Now, nobody could say women who are in the CAW aren't tough. I never heard anybody say that, and I don't think anybody would. But what we heard at that conference, and this is in a union, your union, which has the strongest policies on sexual harassment of almost any union in the country, and women in workshops in that conference said that they clocked in an hour early and clocked out an hour late to avoid being sexually harassed at the punch clock. And you just think about that for a minute, that those women were staying 2 hours extra at work because they didn't want to have to deal with the sexual harassment of coworkers, and they didn't feel that they could get help to stop it. Whether that was true or not, they didn't feel they could get help to stop it. And when they talked about solutions, they talked about negotiating different hours of work, having flexible work times, so women came to work at a different time than men. And I said back, why don't you get Bob White, who was president at the time, to go and stand at your punch clock and tell the guys to fuck off? But they didn't even think of that. Why? And the reason is Because when women are sexually harassed, experience violence, they experience a sense of a lack of self-worth, a lack of value, and they feel alone, and that no one's going to help them. And this is a common experience among women, whether they're tough and courageous, or whether they're meek and fearful, generally in their lives. It's a common experience because what violence against women does is make us all meek and fearful. And when women are meek and fearful, women are not playing the role we could be playing in society. We are not playing an equal role in society. And that's why violence against women is fundamentally a solidarity issue. Now, we're seeing a backlash against violence against women. When I spoke here a couple of years ago, we were talking about, making awareness grow. We've done that. We created an awareness, and now we see a backlash. It's really not that bad. I told you the story about the Globe and Mail guy. Well, that's common, questioning statistics, despite the fact that study after study after study shows it. Like, I don't care if it's 1 out of 10 women who are battered, or 1 out of 8 women who are battered, or 1 out of 4 women are battered. It's too much, And yet, every study that comes out, we get diverted into these debates about whether it's exaggerated or not. Then we get the men are victims of violence too. And it's true. In general, our society is too violent. But men generally are victims of violence because of what they're doing, not because of who they are. Because they went, they're at a rowdy bar, or, this kind of thing. Because men are victims of violence by strangers or acquaintances, not by intimates. It's a different kind of violence, and it's got different causes and different solutions. So yes, men are victims of violence too, but it's not the same kind of issue, and it doesn't have the same kind of social roots. Then we have this new, very sophisticated form of the backlash, which is the feminist movement is turning women into victims. They're ruining our sex lives. They're making everybody uptight. Men don't know how to function anymore. That kind of rap. And a lot of women, young women, are talking about it. So let me say a few things about that. Violence against women is not about sex. It's not about sex. It's about power. And I don't believe sexual harassment, for example, is about unwanted sexual attention. Now, I haven't met a man yet, if I talk to him for a while, that doesn't know when his attentions are unwanted. Or a woman. I don't know. I think it's pretty obvious. Now, with young people, sometimes it isn't, because there's a lot of confusion about sexuality. But with adults, when your sexual attentions are not wanted, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear. And I haven't ever had a man tell me, if I talk to him about it, that, I can't tell. And so, it's not about not having heterosexual sexual relationships. It's not about being super uptight about it. But it is being a little more careful than before, not assuming a right to a sexual relationship or sexual contact, which many men did certainly when I was young and still do. It's about talking about sex and not just pushing and pushing. And it's about developing new sexual relationships, because the way we related before in a sexual level between men and women was pretty screwed up. And it's not easy to find new ways to relate, but we can, and we are, and we have been over the last 20 years or so. And so the key word is unwanted when it comes to sexual harassment. And the key word is permission when it comes to sex. If someone says no, they mean no. And it's not the women's movement that have turned women into victims. It's the media that does that. Okay? We have never talked about women as victims. Yes, there are women who are victimized, but what the women's movement is about, what feminism is about, is making women powerful, not making women into helpless victims. We believe in fighting back. We believe in collective action. When I speak at university campuses, I encourage women to out these guys that are sexually assaulting women, to go in groups like they're doing at University of Quebec and confront professors who are sexually harassing women. That's the kind of action we need. So that these guys feel isolated, not the women who are their victims. But there are government. It's in their interest to make women feel like helpless victims. And the media does that because they always sensationalize everything. But I can tell you that when I was a young woman, I was out in the streets a lot, which I wasn't supposed to do. I lived in New York for a time. I traveled around the world. And I was assaulted, or there were attempted assaults against me all the time, at least once a month. And I don't believe stranger violence against women has increased at all in the last 25 years. I don't think it's more dangerous to be out in the street today. The only difference is more women are out in the streets today than they were when I was a young woman, when you weren't supposed to go out. And I became a feminist because I wanted to go out by myself. And I wanted to go to a bar alone or a restaurant alone, which I couldn't do when I was young. And we will not allow the backlash to violence against women to push women back into fear of going out at night. And the last backlash, which is the one that sort of blows me away, is this false memory syndrome thing. Now, in the last several years, one of the most powerful, disturbing things that have happened is a lot of people are remembering and talking about incidences of incest. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened in history. When Freud began doing his work, he found a majority of his female patients had experienced incest with their fathers or uncles or grandfathers. But this in Victorian times was so explosive, it was such a challenge to the lies about mythologies about the family and the role of the family that he was convinced to suppress it, and created this theory that these women were imagining sexual relations with their father. And the false memory syndrome movement, it's not a movement, but the idea that these are false memories that are being suggested by psychiatrists and psychologists and that they haven't really happened, is a similar kind of movement to what happened to Freud in Vienna in Victorian times. It's an attempt to deny reality. It's an attempt to deny the reality that the nuclear family, the patriarchal family, is not a safe place for women and children. And that's not true of all families. But for women and children, the most dangerous place, and that statistically, is in the family, not on the streets. And that is a horrible thought, because it's in the family we get love, we get sustenance. We're there, we're in a family to get caring. And when the members of that family, the father, the uncle, the brother, abuse us, either as children or as women, there is no more horrible thing that can happen to you. That breach of trust is the most horrible experience anyone can have. And it scars a person for life. And it takes a lot to get over it. A lot to get over it, and to ever trust anyone again. And we have to look at this reality square in the eye. Not try and turn our backs on it. Because it tells us something about the nature of relationships in our society. Human relationships based on power. And it's the ugly side of that. It's the horrible side of it. But it's what is the reason for it. The reason is not because we're horrible people and really we should just nuke the whole thing and start over again. That's not it. It's about power relations. It's about a society where we learn from the time we're very young that the way to feel good about ourselves is to put down somebody else, is to have power over somebody else. And the more powerless we feel in our own lives because we have a job where the boss is harassing us because we feel we can't do anything about the government. You know, they keep raising taxes, the deficit keeps going up, and they keep telling us they're going to cut the deficit and we're losing our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. The more powerless we feel, the more we feel if we can have power over someone else, whether it's by racism, saying we're better than they are because of their race, or by sexism, or by violence against women, or even violence against children. As long as that's the way we solve the problem, by bullying, if you want, someone else, we're never going to solve the problem. And that's why the issue of violence against women is so fundamental to the struggle for social justice, because it's such an intimate issue. It requires breaking so many patterns of the past to overcome. That if we can break those patterns, if we can break that division between men and women on violence against women, if men can empathize with the position women are in and not feel defensive, because we're not saying all men are violent. That's not true. Most men I know are not violent against women and are horrified by violence against women. But most men I know are really not aware of it. When they had interviews after that Carleton study came out on violence on campus, it was fascinating. Because the women who were interviewed said, oh yeah, this corresponds to my experience. You know, most of the women I know have been sexually assaulted. And the men said, oh no, this is completely exaggerated. This doesn't happen. And so that difference in experience that divides us needs to be overcome. And I think the union movement is the best place, really, to overcome it. Because that's where you have the strongest sense of solidarity and unity. But to overcome it in the union movement, you also have to deal with power relations in the labor movement, which are there. The labor movement, but even with affirmative action, discussions like this, is still very much male-dominated and a male institution. Has very male culture, where women have to fight often to really be heard, especially in unions where men are still the majority. And so dealing with all of the issues of equality, whether it's women's role in the union, whether it's pay equity, employment equity, these are the solutions to violence against women, because it's women's inequality which causes the violence, and it's overcoming that inequality that will solve the violence. So that's the first thing. The second thing is individuals. What can we do? As women, I think we have to try and talk about the issue more and not keep it away from the mainstream of political discussion. Now that's changed a lot. We as women have changed a lot on that and have moved it into the mainstream of discussion, whether in the labor movement or in society. And to give other women support on the issue. You know, when we were discussing it at a previous CAW meeting, and women would say, well, they didn't want to call the guys on the harassment because they didn't want to be isolated. They didn't want to be seen as wimps. They didn't want to be seen as, you know, sort of ratting on their coworkers. And those dynamics we have to break down, and we have to have the solidarity to challenge sexist behavior inside the labor movement and challenge sexist structures. And it's hard to do. It's still hard to do. For men to challenge sexism. At that same OFL meeting, a brother got up and said, you know, it's easy to get up on the floor and make speeches about sexual harassment. What's hard is to tell the brother in the cab next to you on the truck to cut it out when he makes a sexist joke, because that's breaking a taboo. It's breaking the solidarity of the brotherhood to call a guy on sexist behavior or on sexist jokes. It's about building equality in your own relationships between men and women, which isn't easy to do, which takes a lot of work. But, you know, I use this example at the OFL. Even the men I know who are most aware of sexism, most aware of women's issues, still practice sexist behavior in some way or another. You know, it's so rooted, it's hard to root it out. So the kind of thing of just assuming you're going to go out with the boys Saturday night and your partner's going to take care of the kids. Or assuming your job's more important than hers, and you're an activist, so you're out all the time, and not thinking about what that means to the amount of time your partner has to do other things than family and work. These are small things, but they're important to changing the power relations between men and women. In unions, things like sexual harassment policy and the CAW and the recent contract that's been negotiated has a terrific clause about right to refuse work in situations of sexual harassment, which is a tremendous step forward. Sexual harassment policies at labor conventions, which just started in the last couple of years, to make it clear that the union is a sexual harassment-free zone, and that women coming to labor conventions don't have to worry about harassment, and if they're harassed, something will be done about it, and done about it quickly and decisively. Supporting women's groups. Support for shelters and rape crisis centers are very important because the government support is getting low. But also for other women's groups, because if we understand that violence against women comes from inequality, then it's those groups fighting for equality that are going to make the most difference. And now I come to the political agenda. And I'll end on this, and I've resisted it all this time talking about the election, so I can't resist it anymore. I talked at the beginning of the speech about law and order and a law and order agenda. And I want to talk about the Reform Party, because the Reform Party talks about a strong law and order agenda. They're going to really get these criminals behind bars and lock them up and throw away the key. And some people are attracted by the Reform Party these days because they present themselves as the alternative to the traditional parties, and we're all pretty pissed off with the traditional parties, including the NDP right now. And some people think they're an alternative. But let me tell you something about the Reform Party. They do not support a single issue of women's equality. They are against child care. They are against gun control. They are against pay equity. They are against employment equity. They have done nothing in their own party to promote women. And in fact, we hear that when they organize, they contact the man of the house. That's how far back they are. On women's issues, they are so far behind all of the other parties, even the Tories. And it's not just that they're behind, they're antagonistic to women's equality. And while Preston Manning talks a good game, he avoids ever talking about these things, that's the reality of their party platform. What about the Tories? The Tories talk about violence against women. They just spent $10 million on a perfectly useless panel to look at violence against women. But in reality, what they've done is cut funding to shelters, cut fundings to women's groups, cut funding to social assistance so that women who want to leave violent households can't because they can't get social assistance. Created a society in which social inequality is greater, and therefore women's inequality is greater, and therefore violence against women is promoted. So everyone, of course, is against violence against women. It's a motherhood issue. I mean, who's going to say I'm for violence against women? No one's going to say that. No one's going to say that. Everyone's going to say they're against it. But look at what the parties are proposing. And what you'll see is the right-wing parties, in fact, are talking about the kind of society with high unemployment, low wages, weakened working conditions, poor social program, the kind of society where violence against women and children will get worse. The kind of society where inequality between men and women will get worse. And while they all have to talk as if, does that mean I'm out of town? Out of time?
Shut it off yourself.
Oh, I shut off myself. Oh, bang on the table. While they all have to talk as if they're in favor of women's equality because of the successes the women's movement has had, the reality is that they're not. And it's important not to let them get away with that deception. And the fact that we have a woman prime minister, like I say, it's great. We have a woman prime minister, and we broke through a barrier, and I'm happy that she's prime minister, and I'm happy it'll just be for a short time. And we're going to see more of this, you see, more of the opponents of social justice and equality putting women up to speak for them, or even putting minorities up to speak for them. Because the equality-seeking movements have gained a lot of strength in the last 20 years, at a time when, in fact, the working class has been driven back in a lot of ways. You know, on economic issues, we've been driven back in a lot of ways. But on equality issues, we've moved forward. And so you're going to see a lot of women like Kim Campbell espousing very right-wing views. And, you know, then we get attacked in NAC for criticizing her, that somehow, you know, we're breaking the solidarity among feminists. And here's where we come back to the class issues. Well, Kim Campbell's no sister of mine. And that's why we have to understand class, race, and gender. Because if you separate out any of the questions, you get the wrong answers. You know, if working class women think Kim Campbell's their friend, they're going to be in for a rude surprise. And if working class men think that they can succeed in a struggle for social justice when they behave in a sexist or racist way, they're wrong. That it's only... Or if white women and men think that we can continue to run our organizations with people of color on the margins, we're in for a very rude awakening. Because sexism and racism, you know, you can make the analysis, and I'm sure some of your workshop leaders will, that sexism and racism are ways that the ruling class, if you want, or the bosses use to divide the working class. And that's true. But it's also true that we've internalized them and we act them out ourselves. It's not anymore just artificially imposed. You know, like Gail Stacey Moore says, who's the head of the Native Women's Association, she said, well, the Indian Act brought patriarchy to our people, but our men took to it like a fish to water. You know, so it is true that racism and sexism are tools to divide the working class. But it's also true that they're rooted in all of our hearts, unfortunately. And that we have to break down the behaviors that divide us, and we are often agents of those behaviors. And so it means challenging each other and not pretending the differences don't exist. What we've learned in NAC is that you have to recognize the differences, recognize the difference of experience, recognize the privilege you have, whether relative privilege, whether it's because you're white or because you're male, not to feel guilty about it, not to feel that you don't have a role in the movement, but to understand how your behavior can be oppressive to another sister or brother. And understanding this and changing our behavior in relation to each other will be a key to creating the strength and the power we need to fight back against our enemies and to fight for a society of true justice and equality. Thank you. Oh, I gotta make it.
Sure. so, solidarity. So, solidarity. So, solidarity. So, solidarity.
There you go. I love talking to labor groups. Okay, I forgot one thing. Thank you very much. I forgot one thing, which is I have with me some copies of the NAC Voters Guide, which is a book we've put out. It talks about women's issues in the federal election. It's only $5, and I'll have it after if anybody would like a copy. I have a few that I can sell. Thank you.
Okay, good. I think what we'll do now is, in order to have a good discussion on Judy's remarks, I think we need a stretch and a bit of a smoke if you're a smoker or what have you. But let's keep this one short because we'll take another break between this discussion that's coming up and our next two speakers. So let's take about 10 or 15 minutes to try to keep that, okay?
You didn't give
we'll
me
come
time.
back and discuss.
You didn't give me time.
Eh?
You didn't give me time.
No, I knew I wouldn't give you time.
I talked for, what,
Beautiful.
45 minutes?
10 notes.
Is it okay?
Was it okay?
Just right, just right. We had Lenora, I told you we had Lenora.
Hein? Quoi? Le guide, je les ai en français. On les a... Denis, on les a achetés pour toutes les régions. Oui, je les ai. On a acheté pour toutes les sections locales.
You get? Let's organize some